this, right? You want to think about who are you impacting with the change that you're putting into your production environment. Don't start by impacting everyone, right? Because then if something goes sideways, you're in a world of hurt. And also, you've done a lot of harm to a lot of people that you didn't mean to, and those are your customers.
I will introduce our first speaker, Adam, who's running product at a very interesting company called LaunchDarkly that I've been keeping up with for quite a while. I'm friends with the founder of the company and the founders of the company. And Adam is the VP of product, and let's see, where's your bio? There it is. Adam has over 20 years of experience working in a variety of roles from software engineering through to technical sales. He's worked in both enterprise and consumer companies such as VMware, EMC, and GitHub. And Adam is driven by a passion for inclusive leadership and solving problems with technology. One additional objective is to be part of a diverse and equitable company, not simply an organization that accepts diversity, but one that actively pursues a more diverse and inclusive team as an imperative for building better products and services. Adam is also an advisor for a number of startups and nonprofits. His perspective on life has been shaped by a background in physics and visual art, an ongoing adventure as a husband and father, and a childhood career as a fire juggler. Ooh. I have, interestingly, I started my amateur photography career taking pictures of fire twirlers, and that was pretty fun. So with that, I will hand it over to Adam, and he has a really interesting talk on progressive software delivery for us. Round of applause for Adam. Thanks.
All right. Get all mic'd up. I think so. Boom. All right. So thank you very much for the introduction, Javed. Happy to be here with you all tonight. In case anyone was actually wondering if I was kidding about the fire juggling, no, that's actually a thing. So currently, I've kind of transitioned a little bit very recently. I'm actually moving on to a role of VP of Platform. I ran product for just about 2 years at LaunchDarkly, and taking on slightly shifting role of looking at building out a larger context of ecosystem, and kind of continuing to help shape the direction of the product, but realize that as we've grown, more and more people are starting to build on top of LaunchDarkly, and need to make sure that they're being serviced appropriately. Previously, as mentioned, worked in tech for a while, mostly on the enterprise side. When I was at GitHub, I was even brought in to kind of help think about how to build out GitHub as a platform, specifically with the intent of looking at how that would fit better with the enterprise notion of being able to have well-integrated systems that are working at large scale. What I'm here to talk to you tonight about is a slightly, kind of tangential topic. This is actually a hypothesis that I have been thinking through and thinking about for quite some time, basically since I was at GitHub, so about 4 years ago. And I've come to refer to this as the daughter-mother-in-law challenge. You may be asking why. So on the left-hand side here, this is a picture of my daughter. This is a couple years ago. She is in the process of replacing the screen on her iPod Touch that broke. And I told her that I was not going to get her another one, but if she wanted to replace the screen, I would help her do that. So she is a true digital native. She has grown up in a world where the iPhone has always existed, the internet is always on, and whatever you need, there is an app for that. She will pick up any piece of technology, and she will be able to figure out all of the advanced functionality and determine whether or not it meets her needs in about 3.2 seconds. It's amazing. It's awesome. She does not want a static application environment. On the right-hand side, this is a picture of my mother-in-law's desktop. For those of you that are wondering what those red marks are that I have added to the photo, those are over her passwords. Okay, now, before you think that this is cruel, this is not. My mother-in-law is actually a very talented programmer. She's been a statistical programmer for almost 30 years. She works in SAS and does statistical research and statistical calculations for UCSF. And has been doing that for almost 20 years. So extraordinarily comfortable with computers, using computers as a tool. Now, the interesting thing to point out is that when I say using computers as a tool, she truly takes this literally. And when she thinks about her applications, she wants her application to be a lot like this hammer that she has, all right? So in her kitchen junk drawer, yes, she has a kitchen junk drawer, there's a hammer. That hammer belonged to her father. She knows that every time she needs to hit something really hard, she can go and open that drawer and she can pull out this hammer. It looks the same, it's the same color, it feels the same, and it does the same thing. She wants her application, specifically in this case SAS, or whether it's her desktop environment, she wants that behavior to be consistent just like that hammer. She doesn't want things changing, out from underneath her. If you change the color of a button, or if you move it from one side of the screen to the other, you literally ruin her productivity for a week. Right? She just wants that consistency. She's learned how to do things. She will literally, when she has a new workflow that she needs to do, she will take handwritten notes. And then she will refer to those notes until she has memorized them. Right? So if you change it on her, she's extraordinarily distraught. So I think about where application development is headed in kind of the next few years. And something that was a realization to me a few years ago, and something that I've been continuing to think about as I continue to work with and talk to developers and organizations that are building new applications, is that the persona on the left and the persona on the right, within the next 5 to 7 years, that's about the time horizon, those two personas are literally going to be sitting at desks side by side, being asked to do the same job with the same tools. And we, as application developers, as software developers, need to think about how do we serve both of those individuals equally? And how can we do that without slowing down our own development teams or limiting our own tools? Okay? So, this is where we talk about, okay, well, let's think about why this is challenging. Why is this something that's occurring? The main reason for this is that for years now, we have been thinking in the world of software delivery in this notion of release velocity, right? We all want to move faster. We think that it is important, it's imperative for our software teams to be able to build and deliver as quickly as possible. As engineers, I've been an engineer, want to be able to ship the things that we're working on. We want to see that kind of continuous improvement, that continuous delivery model, right? So the main objective from a business perspective is ultimately faster time to market. You want to be able to get that new feature functionality out as quickly as possible. Now, the interesting thing in working in the enterprise space is that there's also this kind of caveat. I want to do that more quickly, but I want to do it with less risk, okay? So where our industry and where a lot of our kind of trends have taken us is to the notion of continuous delivery. Now, who's familiar with continuous delivery? Most of the people? All right, so continuous delivery is this notion where you are continuously improving your product. You are continuously releasing new updates. You are not going through, this notion of a few years ago, when I started out in software development, you would name your software release after a year, because you weren't going to have more than one that year, right? So it made sense. Now, like fast forward to, early 2000, that was when Salesforce, revelation of being able to have consistent quarterly releases. So 4 releases a year, all right? And then move forward a little bit further, and Facebook was really the first kind of large-scale company that, kind of came out with this, mantra of, shipping, on a regular basis, right? The whole thing that they would kind of talk about was they wanted every engineer that started the company to be able to push code to production within the first day, right? Now, one of the things that they did was that they had a lot of things in place to be able to support that, right? But ultimately, that was the idea, was this continuous delivery model. And continuous delivery is really amazing, right? The engineers love it because they have the ability to be able to move really quickly. They can see the progress that they've been able to contribute in the product. The challenge with continuous delivery is that it's great and fast until there are problems. And all that does is make your problems grow larger faster, right? So we've started to think about how can we accommodate for those problems that can occur, right? If you were constantly pushing to production, you need to have the systems in place in your infrastructure to be able to support a failure, right? You need to think a lot more about what happens if this change that I put into production causes some type of outage. How do I recover from that quickly? Ultimately, what you want to do is you want to get to this mentality where you can deploy code whenever you want, right? So you can actually put it into an environment whenever you want to. But you can release when that code is ready. And what I mean by release is make visible to your end users. And so this is the kind of separation that we've started to think about. This was part of the original continuous delivery model. Now, another aspect that is a key component in doing continuous delivery successfully, now I could argue that this is one of those things where a lot of folks miss this component or miss this tool, and it makes it much more difficult for them to be successful with continuous delivery, is a technology called feature flags. Who's heard of feature flags? A lot of folks? Many folks? All right. So feature flags, real quickly, it's a control point in your code. That gives you the ability to change things from an external point in your code that can actually be changed during runtime. So you don't have to reinitialize, you don't have to restart your application, you don't have to redeploy your application for that change to be picked up. Ultimately, notice this is a little bit dark, sorry about that. The idea is that it's a fancy if statement. All right, you're being able to put some type of attributes that are in this conditional statement. If those attributes are met, then you will expose the new code path. If those attributes are not met, then the user or the individual or system that's reading that code will just get the known good code path or the old existing code path. All right? So ultimately, what this comes down to is these are control points in your code. Right? Gives you the ability to actually impart change on your code without having to redeploy, without having to reinitialize your application stack. Everyone with me? All right, great. So an example of how this changes and impacts folks, not just, a lot of times people think about the idea of feature flags being something that you use for like a front-end A/B test or experiment type environment, but think about it in a much deeper context. This is an example that actually the slide was put together by a SRE or DevOps engineer at Atlassian. And they were talking about how feature flags have enhanced their ability to continuously deliver. And what they've said is that they've now gotten to a point where they are, building with a, feature flag first mentality. With how do I actually put these control points in my code to make sure that I have the flexibility to impart the changes I need when the code is in production. And what this has done is that their mean time to recovery, so from if they have an incident, if there is some type of failure of a part or a segment of their system, with the feature flag, they actually have the ability to recover in about 200 milliseconds. And I have an extra 0, so sorry about that. But from the other, kind of mechanisms that they have, procedures that they have for being able to recover, whether that's going to redeploy a previous version or actually do like the revert of a commit into their production, you can see it takes significantly longer for them to recover from those types of outages. And so it just kind of speaks to this notion of if you're going to move fast, make sure that you actually, kind of put the right controls in place to be able to recover from any type of misstep. With this in mind, and some of these kind of changing tools that are emerging to make continuous delivery more useful, more successful, I started having some conversations last summer with an analyst friend of mine named James Governor. He's an analyst for a company called RedMonk. It's an industry analyst firm. And one of the things that he also started to notice was that people who were pursuing continuous delivery kept getting hung up because they did continuous integration, which most of you familiar with continuous integration? Just show hands real quick. Yes, so this is, tools like, Circle CI, Jenkins, Travis CI, things like that give you the ability to automate your tests. So when you check in your code, it actually automatically runs through tests. We'll do some validation. You can add to the tests. You can refine them. It can check for everything from syntax checking all the way through to actual runtime checks of making sure that an application is actually spun up with the new code to test and see whether or not it meets certain criteria, can execute certain calls, things like that. Very powerful, also an imperative for being able to move very quickly. Right, if you have someone that has to manually test every single code change and you're trying to ship or check in code to production on a minute basis, that's a lot of overhead and resources that just is untenable. So continuous integration is a big part of it. One of the things that he found in talking with a lot of large-scale customers as they were trying to make this transition from a quarterly or monthly release cadence to a weekly or daily or multiple times a day cadence is that they needed additional tooling that just wasn't being really prescribed in the notion of continuous delivery. And so we really kind of started talking. We said, there's really not only a change in tooling, but there's a little bit of a change that's needed in the thinking about what our goals are. And so in that context, we came up with a new term that we have been kind of socializing and talking with people. Topic of my presentation is progressive delivery. And so let's talk about now what is the distinction between a continuous delivery and a progressive delivery. There are two key distinctions, all right? To move from a continuous delivery model to a progressive delivery model, you really want to think about two things. One is release progression, all right? And this is the idea of slowly increasing or progressively increasing the number of users that have the ability to see the change that you have created or imparted in your system. And the second notion is delegation. And this delegation goes back to what I talked about earlier of control points. Right? What you want to do in a progressive delivery model is we need to start recognizing that more and more roles within companies have the need to be able to interact with technology and with the end user's experience of technology. Right? It's no longer something where you want your customer support representatives to have to open a engineering ticket to get engineers to update a configuration file or a setting on behalf of a user. You want your customer success individuals or support individuals to be able to take care of that on their own. So how do we start thinking about delegating the control of who has access to certain functionality beyond just engineers or developers? So with every software development lifecycle, you need to have stages of that lifecycle. The three that we've identified are concept, launch, and control. Getting into each one of those a little bit, I'll go through this a little bit quickly. Concept is simply looking at Atlassian as a great example of that model, where they've started to think about how can I actually think about a new feature at the very beginning stages of design and concept, and what controls do I want to put in place for when that feature is actually released or gets to the point of being exposed to my end users? What controls do I need? And this isn't just of, like, oh, I want to run an experiment, so I want to make sure that I have the ability to do, option A, option B, or some type of experiment-based test. This could also be something like, oh, I'm making an infrastructure change, and I want to be able to control, by geo, how that infrastructure change is rolled out, right? Starting to think through, where are those control points that you want both on the front end as well as on the back end to be able to give your operators and the people that are responsible for the business outcomes as much control as they need to be successful. The next phase is the launch phase. The launch phase, typically in either like older software development life cycles like waterfall or agile, and even to a degree with continuous delivery, has always been kind of a binary thing, where it's either on or it's off. You've either shipped it or you haven't. And the change and distinction in progressive delivery is it's really trying to pull forward some of the initial ideas that were actually written about in continuous delivery, but seldom executed. And that's the idea of being able to actually control your blast radius, right? You want to think about who are you impacting with the change that you're putting into your production environment. Don't start by impacting everyone, right? Because then if something goes sideways, you're in a world of hurt. And also you've done a lot of harm to a lot of people that you didn't mean to, and those are your customers. So how do you start thinking about slowly and progressively exposing people, and this is the progressive release notion in progressive delivery, as part of your strategy? A big part of this is, so this is a popular meme. I actually remember when I was years ago launching a service for VMware, and one of my developers literally accidentally left this on the screensaver of all the systems. We had about 1,000 systems that were hands-on labs for users, and left this as the screensaver because he didn't remember to change it. It was joke. Now, what we're seeing more and more is that this joke has actually been turned into a requirement in reality. And what I mean by that is that I've got a pretty decent laptop. I know that systems are getting bigger and beefier. Still really hard to cram the entire internet onto your laptop. So if you're running a production service at global scale, the reality is that you are not going to be able to replicate your production environment in any type of staging or local environment. And so you need to have the tools to be able to test in production, but do so with less risk. And then the final stage of this life cycle is the notion of control. Control, products and features, they're never done, right? And so if you think about something, oh, I can ship it and forget about it, you're probably missing the point. And this is where I want to kind of start to circle back with some of the context of these kind of long-term use cases of control. Things like circuit breakers or control valves, they're often called, or fire breaks for the infrastructure side of being able to actually say, oh, well, I just want to roll this out to a portion. This could be things like blue-green deployments or canary launches are often terms that are used for this type of exercise. Being able to also create some feedback loops of using your APM or monitoring tools to be able to look at thresholds for when you start to roll out new feature functionality or new code into your production environment. This kind of progressive delivery model, it really is something that starts to expand and touch all different aspects of your business. We recently had a user conference that LaunchDarkly did, and there was a wonderful presentation by a woman who runs product or is on the product team at Seesaw. And she actually gave a great talk on the use cases that they have been successful with in using feature flags for multiple roles outside of engineering and product. So she gave examples of how customer success, sales, HR, and I think it was their finance team uses feature flags to be able to enable them to have controls over their software without having to engage with engineering. Bid change or iteration or optimization of that workflow to one person who's capable of saying, okay, I'm working in an environment that's literally going to change out from underneath me while I'm using it, and that's fine. Because that means that developers are working on it, and it means it's a hot application, I want to use it. And then the other persona, where they really don't want things to change except at a predictable cadence. You know, and the kind of last thought that I'll leave you with is that this isn't just about age. You know, for those of you that have actually worked with any type of government organizations or regulated industries, oftentimes there are legitimate reasons that they have for being able to want to slow down how quickly their applications change. They have documentation requirements. They have training requirements that they have from unions. All of these things are reasons why we as developers need to think about, okay, how can we build quickly, release quickly for the people who need that and want that? But how can we at the same time have the level of control that we need as, you know, owners of those services and applications to be able to slow things down for the people who have that requirement? Okay? And so that's why and what progressive delivery is. But thank you all for your time, and happy to take a few questions. Yeah?
I heard you mention control plans. Could you describe that a little bit more?
Control plan.
Or did I mishear you? I heard
control points.
points.
Control points.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So.
You want to maybe expand on that a little bit?
Sure. So the idea of control points is you think about it's a switch, it's a dial in your application that gives you the ability to, you know, either change from, you know, outcome A to outcome B, or code path A to code path B, or you could do, you know, multiple variations, A, B, C, or you could even have it be something where it's a, you know, a controllable numeric value, where a great example is API rate limits. If you wanted to be able to adjust an API rate limit, instead of hard coding it into your code that would require the restarting or reinitialization of your service to change, you could actually put in a numeric value into a feature flag, and then you'd have the ability to change that on the fly.
So control point and feature flaggers are
Control point and feature flags are synonymous, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah?
I have a question about the rates that you posted earlier. It's really two parts. Why 60% specifically that you mentioned a couple times, like up to 60%, and what does 100% mean?
Fair enough. So you're talking about the rate of adoption. Why did I say 60% and what does 100% mean? So in the report that graph came from, they were really looking at greater than 60% as being a kind of crossing the chasm or significant inflection point, as opposed to there's very seldom, it's the long tail effect of getting to 100% adoption of a technology, right? That can take longer, but it was the idea of 60% represented that notion of, okay, we've passed the idea of this being something new or just early adopters taking on. Does that make sense?
And
Okay.
100% is just depending on product.
Yeah, I mean, it may be that, you know, from a population perspective, you may never reach 100% adoption because you may not have 100% need, right? So it's more a function of when is that kind of like mass adoption going to be there for some new technology.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions? No?
So when you talk about the delegation piece, I think that makes a lot of sense, specifically thinking about like how work's going to evolve for different, you know, users within a business.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just share with us like any examples? that you
Sure.
can think about what that's looked like?
Yeah, so we work with a few manufacturing companies where they create, you know, physical equipment. And it used to be that equipment did not have any type of digital components in it. Now there is a lot of, you know, IoT or, you know, like there is software everywhere, right? This is the whole kind of Mark Andreessen notion of software is eating the world. It has eaten the world. You now find software everywhere, right? And so it used to be that when there was a problem with the software, the person that you needed to turn to was the engineer. However, more often than not, these organizations have been built up over time where the interface between the customer and the organization is not an engineer. It is a support person who maybe is used to mechanical troubleshooting, right? And so they're now in this situation where they're taking the first call and they're trying to help out. Now, do you want the long-term behavior to be, oh, well, anytime it's a software issue, I immediately need to escalate to an engineer, even if it's something where like they bought and paid for a new feature and for some reason it didn't get enabled on their device? Well, if you can enable that support engineer to be able to push a button or add that person's username to a field very quickly and easily, you have just enabled them to solve the problem without having to take up engineering time, right? So how do we start to think about this notion of controlling the software behavior as something that does not need to be limited to an engineer? And being able to have known good code paths so that when a non-engineer makes a change, there's a predictable outcome. Does that help?
Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you.
Of course.
From like a feature flag perspective, is there like a maximum size or is it like an optimum size, or can it kind of go the whole way up to the entire application / platform?
So the question being like in terms of like what the control point or a feature flag would actually change the outcome on.
How much might fall over before you, like, could you have the whole application roll back to a previous version, or are you talking like, I don't know, a field or a...
Yeah, so we've seen different, folks use them differently. The kind of one interesting example is, so IBM runs their Kubernetes cloud by being able to use feature flags from LaunchDarkly to be able to actually control which version of Kubernetes pods are deployed into which portions of their infrastructure. So they're actually using it in the equivalent of like a lightweight service mesh. If you're familiar with like Envoy or kind of that type of relay proxy, that's how they're using feature flags. That's not I wouldn't say that that's something that everyone is doing by any means, but it does kind of give you an indication of the flexibility. Ultimately, like I said, you're creating an if statement. So any type of conditional that you want to put in place to be able to fork your code path, you can do that anywhere in your code. It just doesn't make sense, right? So depending on your use case, you'd have a different portion of code using it. One of the things that I saw very successful in kind of like early adoption of feature flags in that context of thinking about like how do I get started or like how much should this hide or control was during my time at GitHub. I saw it as a regular practice. Anytime you are creating a fork or a branch to be able to create new code or new functionality, the first thing you do is you put a feature flag in place. And the reason that you do that is that you can immediately then check the code back into trunk, and you can continue development. And the idea was that developers would never have code checked out for more than a day. And ideally, they were actually checking back in more frequently to avoid merge conflicts. Right, so this is using feature flags as a way to be able to make sure that the little chunk of code that your developer is working on is almost there right from the beginning. So it's like the real-time coding into production, right? But there's this kind of gate in the way that prevents it from having any type of negative impact on the production system. So it's off by default. And then as they build out the actual workflow or the code path more significantly, then they can start to turn it on for a few people, start to turn it on for a larger and larger audience.
Is it fair to say then if you're trying to launch more progressively, it should be kind of in smaller pieces? Or is that not?
I mean, I think it goes back to, again, your customers, right? Like I've also seen, people who, because their customers are government or regulated industries, their release cadence from a customer perspective can still be on the order of months or quarters, right? But what they've done is they've been able to push that code incrementally back into their production environment that's then visible by their developers or by their internal staff to be able to test and validate and potentially open up to a few customers to be able to do test and validation without having to expose to everyone. So an example of like that kind of like hierarchical level of flags is Atlassian a couple years ago, they used LaunchDarkly across their entire product portfolio. And during the keynote at their summit event, they had a top-level flag that they actually flipped on stage that redid the branding across their entire product portfolio. So each one of those changes was actually multiple flags underneath for each of the individual products. But then there was this kind of master switch that they were able to turn on that then it made it visible to everybody. Does that help?
Yeah, great.
Perfect. Awesome.
On your slide regarding progressive delivery, you had something under sales and customer success, entitlement and plan management. Can you explain how progressive delivery impacts customer success?
Sure. So on the slide where I mentioned like different use cases for these control points and the kind of delegation aspect of progressive delivery, on the sales persona, I mentioned entitlements and plan management. And this is the idea of being able to, like if you think about you're offering some type of service or some type of application and you have a silver tier and a gold tier that you want to enable for different feature functionality or different limits. What you can do is you can actually build a feature flag that will be there for a long-term use. So there's the kind of short-term use case of being able to like help get things out. And then once they're out, you want to clean up your technical debt and get rid of that flag and make it a default use case that it just does the new thing. But for a long-term use case on the entitlement side, you may want to actually have that feature only available to people on the gold plan, right? And so you would just want to be able to move the notion of that user ID from one to another if they were to change their plan type, as opposed to actually changing or getting rid of that flag itself. Yep.
I have a question. So as a product manager, like being at like a startup where feature flag, like you mentioned at GitHub, is like always necessary for engineers to do. Being a product manager at a startup that might not already have that like culture evolved within the organization.
Yeah.
What's the best way for a product manager to communicate if they want a feature flag to be? Obviously, you can put it in the requirements. Is it necessary to do that, or like what's the best way to communicate that?
Yeah, so question was around how do I get started as like a product manager that wants to encourage engineers to build with feature flags. Part of the like notion that I've been thinking about from a progressive delivery model is that the feature flag starts to be part of the discussion during the initial speccing out of what's going to be built. And the easiest way that I've found to be able to do that when talking with engineers is you start talking about, well, most engineering teams these days are working in some type of sprint capacity, right? Where they've got either weekly or biweekly sprints, and then they've got something that they want to demo. Being able to encourage them to think about using feature flags to do this so that they can actually demo it in production is a great way to encourage them to be able to say, hey, look, if we use something like this, then you can actually give a demo that is functional, not from just your laptop. You can actually use it with kind of real data or real world environment. An additional way to do that is that you put it in the requirement of you want to be able to isolate this feature for a certain subset of your user population, whether that's like a beta cohort or specific users. We also see a lot of companies doing a lot more like staff testing or like dog fooding by using feature flags to expose to only people from a specific domain or things of that nature. Starting to have that conversation of being able to reduce the risk of the development is great. Once they start thinking about that kind of short-term use case of being able to expose gradually before everyone, you can have more conversations about how you can also bring the operations team or your DevOps team into the conversation and say, wouldn't it be great if something went sideways, you could turn it off? Those types of things also are great support, supporting conversations to have. It depends on the culture you have at the company of, whether or not your engineers carry pagers or, whether or not they, are just throwing stuff over the wall. But oftentimes, it's an easy conversation to have with developers because you're giving them the ability to move more quickly. So, yeah.
So, working at a small startup I was pushing to get people to adopt feature flags. And one major issue I found is that some developers are really particular about code quality, and they see that if they have multiple branches in the code, that it adds more complexity, and they get nervous about that, and they're like, no, I don't want that extra complexity in the code. So I found that explaining it as that complexity exists in your system. It's either in a branch or it's in the code, but either way, it's in your system, and you have to manage it somehow.
Yep.
Explaining it to them that way I found really helps.
Yeah. And we've also seen that, organizations that have started to adopt kind of a DevOps methodology where there is a tighter integration between operations and development, it is just a very easy conversation to have. If there is that kind of separation or segmentation, it is, part of this comes back to that, like the notion of empathy. How do you actually start to have a conversation with your developers of the reason why operations is, reluctant to accept your changes or put your changes into production is because they don't feel like they have any recourse if things go poorly, right? So being able to kind of create that connection, I think, is an important role of a product manager as well.
Sure. I just think it's important to be explicit, right? Like, because in my previous role, there's been times where we built features with the feature flag, and I almost assumed that they would build the next smaller features with the feature flag, and they didn't.
And it was, yeah.
It's kind of a hard, I just feel like there needs to be a point of
I think that also another part of it that we've seen is that the lighter weight the system is that's managing the flags, the easier it is to convince them to use it. And I think that also if you have a system that provides tooling to be able to help you remember to clean up flags that are stale or flags that are no longer being needed, that also is something that makes the kind of more senior developers feel a lot better, saying that no, you can keep your code clean. This will help you do it, but it gives you the additional confidence to move more quickly.
So sometimes with feature flag schedule almost, where you pull out the old
Yep, like one of the things that, so we've got some tooling built into our platform. I've also encountered organizations that what they'll do is when they do the build of the feature and they actually get to the point of doing a pull request, they'll create a second pull request at the same time that is actually the removal of the flag. And so it's like part of their whole thing that this is like, they can use this as a mechanism and as a reminder that, oh, I still have an open PR on that to be able to take the flag out at a certain date or time. Yep. Cool. Any last questions? Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Couple plugs for LaunchDarkly, actually. So their CTO wrote a book recently that's been published.
Indeed.
What is it called?
I
forgot the name.
It is.
He wrote a book, and it's online, and it's. I've kind of scanned through it already.
It's looking at the broader context of feature management.
Yeah.
And so thinking about like how do you actually do. How do you have more thoughts around the holistic approach to your application delivery and being able to think through different use cases where feature flags would be helpful, and also if you're going to build your own feature flag system, how do you do it in a way that's going to scale for your organization?
Yeah. And they do have a startup plan, I think. So if you want to
give it a shot. If you want to give it a shot, we've also got a free trial. So feel free to take a look at that and take it for a spin. And if you got any other questions, feel free to reach out to me. Like everyone else here tonight, we're hiring. So, it's been great. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
We have Saurabh. So, did I say it right? I'm so sorry. Yes. Okay. So he's a PayPal senior product manager. He's going to talk about decoding user feedback, data versus insights. So Saurabh is a young professional with extensive experience in product management, business strategy, and growth. He's been part of startups, multinational corporations, as well as not-for-profit sector in domains including payments, e-commerce, ed tech, media, and content, where he worked and led teams to build products of great impact. Currently, he leads the consumer mobile platform and web platform to deliver user delight for 260 million customers across 200 plus global markets at global payment leader PayPal. In the past, he was part of the initial product team at one of India's most well-known startups, Paytm during early and growth year journey of 10 million to 200 million customers. He also led product and business at Careers 360, India's well-known ed tech media startup, and has and had his startup stints at Technox and Neuron, amongst others. And with that, I'll hand it over to Saurabh. And I'll.
Okay, so one example of bad user design we already saw. So thank you for coming. This is definitely not a tech-heavy topic. It will incline more to understanding people, understanding users, and when you're building for people, you need to understand them. Otherwise, what you eventually end up building is what you really like, which might not be something what people are expecting. So I'm not sure.
Oh, it's not plugged into your laptop?
I think this is, okay. I'll use my laptop, that's fine. Okay, so first part of the overall scheme of things is ability to listen. We all have been into meetings in general. We often see people have opinions. And we live in a world where having an opinion is kind of becoming important. You see people tweeting all the time, Snapchatting all the time. In meetings, you see people having opinions without having data a lot of times. What it truly comes back to is whenever we are in general talking about building anything, it boils down to one thing, that is about listening. Same applies for all of us. Not being able to listen is one of the core reasons. I'll talk about some of the examples as a user we all have had. Companies have done those mistakes. What really ends up causing confusion for us as a user. Talking about data or user feedback, it's a very broad term. Doing a quick show of hands, if some of you have done qualitative research, user lab testing, okay? How many of you are into machine learning, predictive analytics? Okay, so there is a small journey over here that when you start building, you start from doing qualitative research. It's simply going and talking to a customer, really spending time with them, not to build what you want, but getting to know them what they really like, getting to know their daily schedule, how they deal with their problems, and then identifying, does it correlate with what you are solving? And there are a lot of confusion you can land up if you are going to use that data wrongly. What do you think scale, when we generally say, scale is a very confusing term in general. Let me take an example for you. If you are one of the people who work in a B2B company, your scale might be something like, let's say, 10 Fortune 100 clients. The example Adam gave, let's say if you are building for a big production line, they are your customers. If you start thinking about, for example, flat design, material design, people over there who are operating on those machines, they don't know those concepts. They don't like those designs. What really boils down to is people you are building for, do you really know them? Are you able to build specifically for them, or you are still building for what you know about those concepts? Versus when you talk about going to a broader sense of customer-focused companies. Take an example of, for example, a company which is having 1 million users based in United States. You would be able to identify some patterns how people in one country like using products, and you can have some insights on it. But if you go to other regions, people who know other language, people who are culturally different, some of the products are bound to fail in those examples. And you might have come across some of those products which completely blew you off because they don't fit your culture. They don't fit how you have been trained to think as an individual. So starting with culture as the first part of it, this is a very interesting example. If any one of you have worked at P&G or been to Japan, this was a very famous ad, one of the most famous ads P&G had, where they had a bird. The only difference was there in Japan, there is a different bird which is related to babies, believed to bring babies to the world. What happened when P&G launched this campaign in Japan, people freaked out. They were like, oh, that's not the bird which brings babies. And they stopped using the product. What eventually boiled down at P&G is no one bothered to go and check how people in Japan really think, how mother-in-laws in Japan think about babies, because they had cultural beliefs. They had legacy stories they wanted to believe in. And the product completely failed. Even till date today, P&G's this famous brand Pampers is not the leading brand in Japan market. It's Kimberly-Clark. Consequences of not being able to know your users can be really, really long. And this is one great example of what P&G went through. Language. How many of you are people who speak more than one language? Or more than 2 languages? More than 3? Oh, wow. Arabic is one interesting example of languages. If any one of you speak Arabic, Hebrew, Persian, what is the difference in those languages? You read from right to left. Now, if as a product manager, as a designer, as an engineer, you're not aware about it, what is bound to happen is how you design your product to align, even for images, it's going to fail. Interesting conversation I had a few years back with a friend who was building a startup in Dubai. They were discussing about, okay, we know we need to align our text from right to left, but what about a phone number? What about last 4 digits of a bank? Should I write it from left to right or right to left? Another example is, if any one of you speak German, an numeric number is written in a very long word. If you start writing specifically in that, your button might be breaking up. And there are numerous number of examples. If you search for that, screens would be broken. The reason it happened is someone gave a translator or a machine learning algorithm that this text translate it and take the page live. What they didn't realize is people in that country don't think in that kind of perspective, and it ended up happening. If you talk to people who live in those regions, they would have had numerous number of examples where websites, apps would have had crazily broken experiences in general. Usability is something, if I'll give you this example, you'll all will have an inclination towards one thing. Design would have multiple flavors. Some of you might be liking Google products, some might be a Microsoft fan, some might be an Apple fan, and you might also have hatred towards the opposite OS. I'm one of those. I never liked Android because I was always inclined to iOS. But that doesn't mean Android is bad. Let me give an example. How many are Apple fans who don't like Microsoft? Or Microsoft fans who think Apple is not the best design? Let me show you a small video. Sorry. Okay, let's hold this. So in this, what they are actually doing is they are rebranding Apple iPod by Microsoft. What is happening is how you have seen Microsoft products. If you have ever bought a Microsoft product, even the recent ones like Surface, you would have seen how they package their products. Their design is fairly different. They would try to use space in the maximum possible way. And if they see any kind of white space, you'll see something coming over there. And I'm sure you would have seen all these things happening to a Microsoft product. But the interesting thing to note over here is people who use Microsoft don't really hate it. We might make fun of it, but there is a clear segregation of people who like using Microsoft products. There is a clear segregation of people who are Apple's users. And these companies have established themselves very strongly in their customer segments. This is the funniest one. So the message of this small video, you'll find out it on YouTube also, is in general, people who like Microsoft, if you'll read into comments, you'll realize that they never overreacted to this. But people like me who would have preferred a cleaner design did not react very well. It became a joke for Microsoft for a very long time. That brings me to something which people don't ask us about. Whenever you are talking to users or whenever I'm talking to you, there would be some things you would not mention that you need. But they are very implicit to any product we are in general building. If I was talking to you in probably 2011 or 12, security and privacy would not be a topic you would be really discussing about a lot. How many of you know about GDPR? How many of you know which law GDPR actually succeeded? That law was actually created in 1995. What GDPR actually did is, because there were so many discussions going on about privacy, it became a topic which people are aware about, and not just people in technology, not people who are building products for customers, but actually people on streets. If you go and talk to people in Europe, major cities, you would find people know about GDPR. They know that there would be a cookie pop-up coming again and again. You go to some website, and they would be okay to click yes, because they realized what happened to data in some of the scenarios. Especially after data scandals at Facebook, a lot of people started to not use Facebook because of that incident, which means that the implicit requirements of people for what they were expecting with that product completely changed, and they now want to use products which are secure. They don't want to use products where their privacy is being compromised. A huge percentage of people stopped using mobile apps. That's why if you would see industry trends, browser apps are becoming popular, because the fear that microphone is hearing you and start showing you ads freaked people out, and a lot of people have started talking about that. But what happens when you really don't pay attention to what people are talking about? One example of misinnovation in general is when you ignore where people are moving. Like Adam was mentioning about 60% tipping point. The reason it is always close to around 60% is because after 60%, you don't have a resistance to use the product. When you ask people, they have an acceptability towards the product, and the product is always above the benchmark where the curiosity of people is gone, and it becomes a necessity at a lot of times. Kodak is one great example of it. It was one of the brands which completely blew the world. It had 85 to 90% share at a time, doing very well, but it lacked one thing. It did not move to digital as fast as other companies were doing. And what ended up happening in that process is it even lost its core business of reel-based cameras. Fuji was a company who was growing at that time, and it took over even their market. And in 2012, when Facebook was buying Instagram, they were filing for bankruptcy because they chose not to innovate at the time when users were going towards a particular direction, when the tipping point of not printing photos but sharing it socially was becoming acceptable norm for people. Bad brand perception. We all have heard about brands which crashed because of one single incident. This is one example of a brand in India which faced something similar. If you have heard about the brand Tata, it's a car manufacturing company into a lot of other businesses, and they pitched an idea. They said, we will build world's cheapest car. Everyone appreciated the idea till the time car came out, because guess what? They did a mistake. They branded the car as cheap car. People don't like buying cheap things. They might want to be price conscious, but you don't want to be the person who bought the cheapest product ever built. And that product never sold. Even people in Tata were seen not driving that car, including founder of Tata Group. He was driving a Honda. What happened is they had to shut down production of this car very soon. Here comes a very interesting point you as a product manager or designer would often come around. Should you always listen to customers? There is a myth we always talk about Steve Jobs that he knew everything. That's true. There is only one Steve Jobs who would ever be born. But Steve Jobs had a huge data team who was doing research for him. What it takes us to is when we are talking about users, they don't really know what they want. What they know is what their problem is. But sometimes they don't actually know what their problem is. What they know is what they're going through. It's your job to really go deeper into that and try to identify what would solve their problem. Here is an example which some of you might have heard already, where when we go for the first option, you would always do the mistake. The Jefferson Memorial. The problem which was happening in Jefferson Memorial is it was degrading. The walls were, the quality was going down and they had to work on maintenance. They asked a company that it's degrading, what should we do? They said, okay, let us work on maintenance, and they gave the tender. But what interestingly came out is, why is it degrading? That was a fairly simple question. They said, we are washing it with heavy chemicals. They said, okay, but why are we washing with heavy chemicals? They said, there are a lot of birds who are making it dirty and we need to use heavier chemicals. Someone might have decided to probably solve at that stage, but when they dig deeper, why there are so many birds around? Because there are spiders. Why there are spiders? Because there are insects. And insects are there because they are doing a light show which was causing insects to be there. The overall conclusion was to not illuminate that monument. If someone had decided not to really go deeper and decided to do what was the problem highlighted to them, they would have probably destroyed that monument in the first place itself. That same applies in real scenarios. I was in Brazil doing customer research a few months back. We had a translator who was with us who was explaining us what they were saying in Portuguese versus what we should interpret. Now, there is always a communication gap into that because the person is hearing in Portuguese, they're translating for us. How I am processing might also be slightly different, how I'm understanding the language. One problem he told is people are not keeping money or in banks because carrying cash to banks is a problem because they are stopped on the street, they are robbed, and what eventually ends up happening is either they are piling cash at home or they would stop accepting cash in general. So it's a chicken and egg problem. And he kept insisting on one part in his translation that the problem is robbery. That is the problem we have to solve. But as a researcher, you need to realize this part that if I start believing that I have to solve robbery in Brazil, can I really do that? No. Knowing where this point is coming, where the problem is something you cannot deal with or there is something deeper below that, is where you'll find a lot of interesting scenarios even when you are talking to your users. I think this is broken, but I'll just tell you the story simply. How many of you have rode a water scooter? How many of you have rode the first one? Oh, you are an adventure sports lover in that case. This was the first ever water scooter built by Kawasaki, a jet ski where you have to stand. It needed a lot of skill set. It's not easy. But there were companies who were trying to talk to people and try to understand that why they are not interested into something as cool as this. Because when you look at pictures, it's amazing. But why are people not doing it? There was fear in people. They did not just want to do a sport because they did not have their friends and family around. And what these two companies, Yamaha and Sea-Doo, did is they tried to reduce complexity. They understood that sport is not something people just want to do for adrenaline rush. They want to do because they want to be close to family and do something fun which they can remember. And what eventually ends up happening is they built one seat. But when they built one seat, people said, oh no, we want two. And eventually, most of the water scooters you'll see today would have 2 to 3 to 4 seats even. And it became a family of friends sport because someone cared to know what people are really looking to do when they go around and they want to rent this equipment. A/B test is a very overly used word in general in every tech company. I'm sure most of you would have run some kind of A/B test in your life. We think it's the magical solution to find everything that customer needs. But what we forget is A/B tests are only to measure if A is good or B is good. It is a referential analysis of two things, but very often you'll find companies will make decisions based on only A/B tests. A/B test can only work when you know what A and B should be. If your insights have not been derived already, you would keep doing A/B tests, you would keep reiterating your designs, but you would not be able to find an answer to that because it's only a comparative tool after you know some insights of what people truly want. Whenever you're thinking about testing something, one of the interesting things you might have already done or something you might want to do is cart sorting exercises. If you have worked in a user testing lab, you might have seen some tests going on around when you talk to user, you simply draw something on paper and you try to understand. Does it relate to them? Would that person be someone who is clicking on that button or not? If you always decide to do a testing on live, it might not be the great idea because users build mental models which don't change so easily. Changing behavior of people can be very tricky. For example, if you use iOS, you know what happens on left slide. You know what is going to happen when you swipe top to down. But if you try to change that behavior, it might become very hard for the user because they had a certain mental model that if I do this, this is going to happen. When you try to reinvent the wheel, it might become a confusing thing for people, and if you don't have, let's say, a user base like WhatsApp where you can try to experiment to that level, people might not accept those experiments very easily. People in analytics who mentioned about machine learning, probably they might have faced this issue more than often. And data does not have all the answers. It can give you some correlation of things, but the problem where it comes is in general causation. These are two great examples of it. There is a graph of sales of iPhones versus people who died falling from stairs. Now, there is a correlation between them. You can clearly see the correlation factor is 0.994. But does it mean more the people you kill by falling from stairs, the more iPhone would be sold? That's not going to happen. Similarly, that example that people who eat chicken are the ones who go to moon does not imply that to go to moon you have to eat chicken. In a lot of user cases, you would find there is a correlation between why people are taking an action. It might not be the core reason for that, and that's something you should be interested to look into. In summary, I think to summarize all that part of it is how you identify your nature as an individual to talk to people will define if you can get to know those people well. Before you try to jump into solving their problems, it might be important you just get to know them in their lifestyles, as we were discussing earlier, and not to act on that data. Not every data requires an action. Not every result from an algorithm requires you to make a design change. Try to have a habit of doing user testability in general. Try to test on yourself that would you be the one who would take actions like this and people around you. And having this mental shift would in general allow you to not jump to conclusions very easily and not have a user experience which people might not be looking for. One simple statement to close is, which Theodore Levitt said very rightly, that people don't want a drill machine, for example. They just need a hole in the wall. If you are able to provide them that, probably a drill machine will go out of business. So try to focus on the root cause of the problem than the solution which already exists in the market. These are some of the books. I'll probably send to Nivain and he can pass it on, but these are some of the interesting examples that there is no shortcut to know what to build. It's in general always aligned to user psychology, and that's something you might be interested to learn more on. And yes, if you're already bored, I hope this can compensate for you. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
First of all, great presentation. Really, really useful, and thank you for that.
Thank you.
So you said that in the last part, when there is data, there might be confusion between correlation versus causation, and data cannot tell us the difference between the two. Data will tell correlation as
Right.
causation. So how do you fix that? Is just going by a logical assumption, that's how you can fix that problem, or how do you go deeper if you don't know what exactly is the case?
Good question. I think as a product manager, we make a lot of hypothesis-based decision in general. Not everything we decide to do is always right. And that's why the hypothesis is based on the most accurate model you can find around. Even when we talk about finding correlations, you're building, let's say, a machine learning model, it's you who is training them. If you have a bias for some KPI, your model is not going to give you output suddenly out of the blue. In general, whenever we are looking at data, the easiest to find is correlation. Causation is always going to be something which you go deeper into what they did and what made them take that action is going to describe you. Take an example of number of hits on your website. Number of hits on your website can be correlated to a lot of things. It can be your product is so famous that URL is being shared by millions of users every day. It can be caused by because people read your emails, people follow you on Twitter, and whenever you say they do that. But that might be not be the cause they are actually landing over there. It might be because you bought a pop-up blocker somewhere and which made people click that URL suddenly, right? The cause of that happening, why people are actually taking that action might be different. It might be because you said that go to that link and you'll get $10, but that doesn't mean people love your product. The cause of that is often a very underlying reason of what is leading people to take that action. And it might not always be right. Data will tell you some hypothesis on that, but a lot of times, whatever you take decision as a designer, product manager is a best guess. Anything else?
I was maybe just interested, as a product manager, how do you find, maybe in your current life or in previous places, obviously this is very like user research,
Yeah.
UX heavy topic. How do you kind of interact with your sort of user research leads with, specifically test out these sort of hypotheses, or does that change it?
Yeah, I think we all have been through that, and as product managers, we often have probably dictated the design in general too. I have been there too, where I had some hypothesis in my mind, and when I, let's say, gave wireframes to my designer, I had a very strong impact on this is what I exactly want. But I think if I see how you are saying it as a product manager, it's about that removing that bias from what designer's job is versus what your job is. What you might be designing for is that specific goal you are trying to achieve. Your goal might be to make people complete that payment. But designer's goal might be to give user the best experience and even clarify a lot of things. Even clarify that there is a fees over there. As a product manager, you might not want to display that, because if you show that there is an additional $1 cost, you might see 50% drop. But a designer whose goal is to ensure a user knows best information and then they make the decision, would clearly want to highlight that when you do this transaction, there would be a $1 fee. If you try to confuse those roles and influence designer to the level that don't display it, show a small I button, if they click on it, it opens a new page, and somewhere in that help section, they will find that $1 would be deducted. It will only backlash you. You might end up having bad customer reviews. You might get short-term returns in terms of transactions, but definitely not recurring users who love your product. Does it answer?